Dear YouTube, as you know, under copyright law I am allowed to use portions of copyrighted material, in this case copyrighted material belonging to the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania, so long as this is used for the purpose of criticism and parody. Please remember this when Watchtower comes complaining, because I've embarrassed them by using their propaganda in a way they disapprove of. Thank you.
Hello there. Ever since I started doing videos on YouTube, I've been fascinated with the governing body. In fact, some of my first ever videos under my John Cedars name, obviously the channel is still called John Cedars, but now I've outed myself as my real name, Lloyd Evans. But the first few videos I did were basically about the governing body, and I called my series Getting to Know the Governing Body, and I focused on different governing body members. And my reasoning was that back then it felt as though so few witnesses even knew who the governing body were, let alone some of the outrageous things the governing body were capable of coming out with. It felt like a responsibility, once I started listening to some of the recordings, to get some of these recordings out there onto YouTube so that Jehovah's Witnesses could listen to them and realise this is what the faithful and discreet slave are saying. And very, very quickly, a star of this series came to be Tony Morris, because whenever I got a new recording from one of Tony Morris's talks, I could just bank on the fact that there would be something in there that would be, well, lots of things in there, in fact, that would be just crazy or outrageous or offensive or ill-considered. And yeah, so I ended up doing more videos about Tony Morris than anyone else, and everyone will probably be familiar with the whole tight pants situation and me speaking to Tony on the phone. So I kind of consider myself Tony's #1 troll. And when I found out that the latest regional convention series, the Imitate Jesus 2015 regional convention series, was on YouTube, because thanks to a chap who goes by the name of Wi-Fi Bandit, who uploaded all 3 days, and I noticed that Tony Morris was giving talks on these 3 days. I thought, well, I've just got to do a video. I don't even need to check whether he says anything, because I know he will have said something. So I thought, I've got to do a video, and this is the video. So without further ado, let's go to the Friday afternoon when Tony Morris is first introduced to the convention audience.
Please pay careful attention to this final talk on today's program. It is entitled, Jesus Came to Seek and to Save What Was Lost. And it will be given by Brother Anthony Morris, who is a member of the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses. Brother Morris, we are eager to hear what you have to tell us.
First of all, it's my privilege to bring to all of you gathered here the warm love and greetings of the entire United States Bethel family and the rest of the governing body.
I just thought it was worth showing this introduction for two reasons. One, to show how wooden and unanimated and not particularly interested even the chairman seems when he's introducing Tony Morris. Everything is extremely scripted. There's no real excitement or passion in the eyes of the poor chap whose job it is to introduce Tony Morris. And the second thing I wanted to say was that, you know, how typical every single time a governing body member gives a talk, whether it's at a convention or at an assembly or at a zone visit, they always have to have their position introduced and announced. You know, please pay attention to Brother Anthony Morris, who is a member of the governing body. Well, do you absolutely have to have people announce your positions when you go out on stage? You know, is that the sort of thing that Jesus would have done?
Really, it is never in the history of the modern day organization been more urgent than now to seek out and try to help the inactive return. Because unless you're in a coma or not paying attention, and we can't predict a specific timing, but look at this world. Even the worldly people who have zero interest in Scripture or what's stated there about this time, they're perplexed. Look at it.
So Tony's here starting where he means to go on. He is scaremongering people into believing that the world is in chaos, the world is in turmoil, and apparently even worldly people who have no knowledge of the Bible are perplexed, as he puts it. He's honestly trying to sell this idea that if you're not a Jehovah's Witness, you're walking around in confusion, wondering how much time the world has left. Well, I have news for you, Tony, and I have news for any Jehovah's Witness watching this. That is not how worldly people are looking at world events and the problems of world events. And I'm actually going to put a link to a video in the description, but you can also find this video if you scroll down my channel to my recommended from other channels. Look for a video if you scroll to the right. It's a video called An Astronaut's Guide to Optimism. It's a very short video, less than 2 minutes, and it basically is by Commander Chris Hadfield, who some of you may know was the astronaut who was famous for spending time on the International Space Station and making videos while he was up there. And he does a fantastic presentation about why there are lots of reasons to be optimistic. And he makes a fantastic point. Well, he lists all of the reasons why actually life is improving nowadays. And I would challenge Tony to tell us whether he would rather be living now or in 1919 or 1914. I'm sure he would say now. You know, life is better now than it was when supposedly Jesus first came to the earth. Anyone would say that. You know, unless you are really nostalgic for living in the past. But Chris Hadfield makes a fantastic point, saying yes, there are problems, there's bound to be problems, but that's not a reason for moaning and being negative, that's a reason for doing something. That gives us a reason for living, in other words. When we see things that are wrong about the world in which we live, well, great, there's some incentive to fix them, and we don't fix them by this scaremongering and this negativity and trying to sell this idea that things have never been worse.
Fundamentally, sometimes we'll look around, and it's nice to have a lot of the Warwick workers here. I was over there yesterday checking on the progress, and it's always very invigorating. And you still have to accept the fact, and so do I, is the end going to come before we finish it? And as fast as the brothers and sisters are moving, we can't say and assert that. And recently, we'll be studying it in the months ahead. You have to understand, with Bible prophecy, we've long expected that the end is going to come, the cry of peace and security, and it's on the broadcast. Brother Loesch covered that nicely. We're not coming to a point in this system where anarchy is global. Not before the Great Tribulation, no. So, hence the need to intensify our efforts. We just don't know. I would like to get in to the room I bid on. I don't know what heaven's doing with the room bids, but I don't think there's a bid up there myself, personally. It's like, you're going over here. Yes, sir. Glad I made it.
So now Tony's indulging in a slight stand-up routine where he's joking about whether he'll get a chance to get into the room he's bid on at Warwick before Armageddon comes and he is transferred to heaven, where he won't be able to bid on a room because he'll just be directed where to go and what to do. And it's just, you know, everyone's laughing, everyone's in hysterics, but I just don't get the point of any of this. I don't get the point. I mean, even when Warwick was being designed and discussed, before they even started building it, Guy Pearce, the late Guy Pearce, said that they weren't sure of Jehovah's direction on whether to go ahead with Warwick or not, but they were going ahead with it anyway. And he made the point that you know, maybe Armageddon will come while they're building it. If it does, then great. And yeah, in a way, what difference does it make if this, you know, fictitious event that you're telling us about does come while you're building it? Why the urgency in building it before Armageddon comes? If Armageddon's going to come, then surely it makes no difference whether you get into your room or not. What happened? It's all complete silliness and nonsense and verbal flatulence, but apparently the audience love every word of it.
So I just want to convey that in recent times, to just get the message across, it's urgent. And have that feeling for them. Don't be running around. I mean, we all need a break. You got to have some time. Look around. And don't be caught off guard if all of a sudden the events bring in the cry of peace and security, and then they think these last-ditch efforts are going to be okay. No. We got to help the inactive now to get ready, get back here in the fold, and get ready for the Great Tribulation.
So Tony wants to remind us that things are urgent, that all we need to do is look around us and we can see how urgent, you know, things are and how important it is that we all, you know, become Jehovah's Witnesses or come back to Jehovah's Witnesses. And, you know, watching this bit of the video, I can't help but remember what it was like for me sitting in the audience when I was listening to just this kind of talk. You know, year after year after year, being told, you know, really, no, really. I know we said it was urgent last year, but believe me, it's really urgent this year. And every year is basically repeating that message. And yet there is no cry wolf phenomenon. There is no witnesses, you know, en masse saying, yes, you told us that last year and the year before that and the year before that. And in fact, for every year that I've been a witness, I've been told it's really coming now. Nobody, you know, seems to put two and two together. And I think it's a really troubling aspect of cult mind control, that it's able to completely bypass this normal human tendency to be skeptical and to say, well, hang on, you did tell us that last year, you did tell us that the year before.
I tell you, joy arises among the angels of God over one sinner who repents.
This is very interesting, and I'm going to be going into this in a little bit more detail, but Tony here reads from Luke 15:10 about, you know, joy arises in heaven over one sinner who repents. But he's reading this scripture, I'm going to have to tell you because I don't have time to show you the full talk, but basically this talk is leading up to the release of the brochure Return to Jehovah for inactive ones, and this whole talk is dealing with the idea of inactive ones or witnesses who've simply stopped attending meetings or going on ministry. And what's intriguing is that this scripture in Luke is read, which is specifically referring to sinners, people who commit sin. And there's just this kind of passive-aggressive underlying theme running through the talk that, no, you haven't just lapsed, you haven't just decided it's nonsense and stopped going. Actually, you're sinning. Actually, you're sinning against God.
Now, turn with me to Malachi, chapter 3, and we get the sense of how Jehovah feels here. Malachi 3:7. From the days of your forefathers you have turned aside from my regulations and have not kept them. they're guilty. The inactive, they know they're guilty for straying. But see, does Jehovah hammer that? No.
Jehovah doesn't hammer that, but Tony's going to hammer it for you. Gosh, wow. As I was just saying, and I promised, I warned you I would bring this up again, Tony is trying to get this idea across that, it's not just a blip, it's not just a oops, what have I done, I've stopped going to meetings. No, you're guilty. And I don't even need to use the word guilt tripping, do I? It's not even open for debate when we have a governing body member stood on a platform saying inactive ones are guilty. It's a crime, it's a sin for them to stop going to meetings, it's a sin for them to stop going in the preaching work. They've done something wrong. And that is never a good basis on which to try and appeal for people to come back and do what you want them to do, because you're basically saying, do what I'm telling you to do, because what you're doing is wrong. You're guilty. You're sinful. How dare you?
So here's some personal questions, especially if you're one of the inactive, or you can pass it on to someone you may know. Since you've been inactive, question for you to ask personally, is my life more meaningful?
Listen, I know I'm not inactive anymore, but please let me answer this. Is my life more meaningful? Wow. Yes, absolutely yes. Since I stopped going to meetings, and the last meeting I went to was, let me think, it would have been the memorial in 2013. Was the last memorial I went to, the last time I stepped foot in a Kingdom Hall, and even that was just to appease my family. And since that time I've never been to a meeting, never been to an assembly or a convention. I'm not saying I'll never go to another meeting or convention, because I would be intrigued to go to one again at some point in the future, but is my life more meaningful? Absolutely yes. I never have to base anything on whether it's required of me by the governing body. I don't have to believe things purely because Watchtower tells me to believe them. I can believe things based on whether they're factual or not, on whether science verifies what's being said to me. I now understand my place in society. I no longer have fear or dread of what's going to happen. I don't look at people around me in my community as being doomed, as being sinful, as trying to lead me astray. I have healthy relationships with people who don't necessarily share my same beliefs. So is my life more meaningful? Absolutely yes. Are there problems with my life? There are problems with everybody's lives. Everyone has problems they have to deal with. But it's much, much easier to deal with my problems now that I'm free of this dreadful cult and can think for myself and make decisions for myself and be the master of my own life, rather than letting 7 blokes in New York who I've never met control me.
Am I happier now? Think about it.
I don't have to think about it, Tony. I don't have to think about whether I'm happier or not. I just am happy. Because, as I said, I'm in control of my own life now. And I don't know, I just sense a little bit of... He's asking the questions almost knowing, almost giving a hint of knowing that inactive ones who are, listening to his words, perhaps, on YouTube as we're doing now, are laughing at the questions. He doesn't seem to have a great deal of conviction in the questions he's asking. That's just my view.
So Jehovah invites you to return to his loving arms and to the safety of the congregation, especially now we're so near the end. Why continue to be out there in Satan's wicked world getting pummeled every day with no help?
Whoa, let's just back up a moment. People who are not Jehovah's Witnesses, if you're watching this video and you're not a Jehovah's Witness, or perhaps you've never been a Jehovah's Witness, I've got news for you. You may not realise it, but you're getting pummeled every day. Quite what this means, I have no idea. But again, it's just, we started off right at the beginning of the talk with fear-mongering. Things have never been as bad. Just look around you. People in the world are perplexed. And now we have this idea that everyone who isn't a Jehovah's Witness is being pummeled every day. So apparently we're all being victimized on a daily basis purely because we're not Jehovah's Witnesses.
Well, why should you consider returning now? If you do return, how will you be received? Well, note the answers in the following video.
So we have this astonishing propaganda dramatization, which, is being played at all of the conventions at this point in this talk, where Watchtower gives us its impression of what inactive ones are doing. They believe that inactive ones are sat on their sofas staring plaintively at their modest collection of Watchtower books and yearning to come back, but being deeply fearful of being treated like second-class citizens when they arrive at the Kingdom Hall. That's apparently what inactive ones are doing. Well, I have no doubt that there are some inactive and even lots of disfellowshipped ones who are still under Watchtower indoctrination. That's partly why I make my videos. I don't just make my videos for Jehovah's Witnesses. I make my videos to help even lots of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who for various reasons are still grappling with these feelings of fear and guilt. But the fact that there is fear and guilt exposes instantly the sort of cult we're dealing with. We're dealing with a doomsday cult that says if you don't agree with us, you're going to die. And that's what this young girl was thinking, sat on the sofa, gosh, I'd better get back to the meetings, because if I don't, I'm going to die. That's what Watchtower wants you to think. And let's remember as well what Tony was saying earlier in the video, that if you're not going to meetings and you're not going in the preaching work, in other words, if you're not at a specific place that Watchtower wants you to be at a specific time that it has designated because it's God's organisation, and if you're not propagating the information that this organisation that claims to be God's organisation is giving you, then you're guilty, then you're sinful. We have had the word guilty used in connection with inactive ones out of the lips of Tony Morris, one of the faithful and discreet slave. This is the patronising, deeply condescending and demeaning view that Watchtower has of inactive ones. Another thing I wanted to mention about this video was the love bombing, because this girl is portrayed as being fearful that she's going to be given the cold shoulder, but when she actually does go back to the meeting, she's love bombed. She's hugged from all directions by sisters, which I'm sure is how it does work in a lot of cases. My situation when I was inactive wasn't quite like that. I was love bombed, but only selectively love bombed, and it was quite, without going into too many details because it's not that interesting, but I love playing football, and my congregation where I went to meetings just before I stopped attending had a group of young lads who would get together occasionally on Sundays, not every Sunday but on some Sundays, and they would play football. And as soon as I stopped attending meetings, guess what? They no longer wanted to play football with me. So I was ostracized. I was given what I term preemptive shunning. In other words, we're afraid of the fact that you're no longer going to be a Jehovah's Witness. So before that happens, we're going to start with withholding some of our affection and friendliness. And the amazing thing was that near where I live, there's like a community centre where the congregation occasionally gets together for parties. And I was invited to go to these parties which featured music and dancing and merriment. I was invited to go to those, but for some reason I wasn't allowed to run around a field with a football with some of the young ones. So it was very, very odd, selective love bombing that I was subjected to. And of course I told them where to go. I wasn't interested in going to parties if they were going to shun me just because I was no longer going to meetings. But that was my experience, so I just found that whole element of the video about love bombing quite interesting.
The thing we always like to emphasize with them, see, the positive thing is, you didn't forget Jehovah. You didn't forget his commandments, did you? And they don't. They don't. When you love Jehovah, you don't forget him. See, and when they leave, it's always there, because with his spirit or whatever he's doing, he is trying to draw them back.
It's not Jehovah trying to draw us back, it's called PTSD. And Tony Morris, of all people, should know all about PTSD, because if you read his life story, and one of these days I'm going to get round to doing a video about his life story, because as I said, I'm his #1 troll, and in a recent Watchtower article he treated us to his life story, including the story of his time in Vietnam. And if you read between the lines in what he has to say about Vietnam, it's more or less certain that the guy became a witness because of his PTSD. We are being subjected to this nonsense right now because a Vietnam war veteran, I won't call him a war hero, a war veteran, couldn't get over what he saw in Vietnam and thought that the paradise promised by Watchtower was the fix-all, the panacea that would stop him from ever having to endure that again, and would help him escape from being a charred body, because he obviously believes that when Armageddon comes, everyone who isn't a Jehovah's Witness will become a human hot dog, a charred corpse. And through fear of that, induced by his memories from Vietnam, he became a Jehovah's Witness. And so I just found this part interesting where Tony's saying, oh, you never forget. You never forget, once you love Jehovah, yeah, we do never forget. It's called being in a cult. It's called trying to manage our cult indoctrination. And to some extent, yes, PTSD. I wouldn't say I suffer from PTSD, but I do have flashbacks. I do have fears. I do have a part of my psyche which I've written about in my book, which will be out next year. I do have a part of my psyche that is riddled with this, and I'm managing it better than a lot of ex-witnesses are, but I do get emails from ex-witnesses who very openly say that they have PTSD to the point where they're frightened to venture out of their house just in case they encounter a witness. So, no, you're right, Tony, we don't forget, but it's not for the reasons you think.
And the longer that an inactive one is out there in Satan's world, the more they're going to be mistreated. So as soon as we can help them, something we want to convey to you too, especially you elders, don't wait till they have completely strayed. When they take a false step in decisions they've made in life, take the time to readjust them.
Again, we have this idea that if you leave Jehovah's Witnesses or stop attending meetings, you're going to be mistreated. So terrible things await you if you decide one day to stop going to cult indoctrination sessions, which is what happens at Kingdom Halls, in case you didn't know. And there's also this idea of, elders being required to proactively stop people from becoming inactive. I can only imagine this is going to lead to even more paranoia than there is already.
So what can help us to apply the points that we just considered here? Well, very, very pleased to announce the release of this new 16-page brochure, Return to Jehovah.
So we then have the release of this brochure, Return to Jehovah, and as you can imagine, I've got a lot to say about this brochure, but particularly after listening to what some of my viewers have said, I've decided, by the way, this brochure was sent to me by one of my viewers, so I really must thank her for doing that. I think she even went to the convention to get a copy, so that's absolutely fantastic, thank you. But I was considering doing a review of the brochure as part of this video, but instead I'm going to do that as a separate video. So if you're watching this maybe a few weeks or months later and you're thinking, well, I'd like to know what you have to say about the brochure, just look in my videos and somewhere you will find my review of this brochure, Return to Jehovah. Now let's move things along, and now we have Tony being introduced for his talk on the Saturday afternoon.
In our final talk today, look for ways in which you can reflect the mind of Christ more closely as Brother Anthony Morris, a member of the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses, speaks to us on the theme, Arm Yourselves with Christ's Mental Disposition.
Many people today find the idea of being controlled by anyone to be distasteful.
Not many people, the majority, the vast majority of people find it not just distasteful but wrong to be controlled by anyone. But it's interesting how that's how Tony opens this talk, because let's face it, the governing body wants to control us, and they can hide behind Jehovah all they like. They can say it's not them controlling us, it's Jehovah, it's the Bible, it's Jesus, whoever. But anybody who wakes up from their indoctrination and subjects themselves to an objective and systematic study of the organization and its history realizes very quickly that this is nothing more than a group of men who are themselves deluded, controlling others.
I think you'd agree many in the world have this attitude, nobody tells me what to do. Well, we have news for them in Ephesians chapter 2, whether they'll admit it or not. Here's the facts. Ephesians chapter 2, they all say they're thinking for themselves. And I don't know if you know the news, but my wife has a lot of Irish content. And she's a bit upset when I broke it to her that in Ireland, first country, to have a popular vote approving same-sex marriage. So her Irish was coming up out of her there a bit. I won't go beyond that, as I had to go home later.
This was just a truly bizarre part of Tony Morris's opening remarks from his Saturday afternoon talk. I mean, he's basically making this veiled, or not so veiled, criticism of the referendum that happened recently in Ireland, where it was the first referendum that granted equality for homosexual people to get married just as easily as heterosexual people. And rather than openly or overtly criticise it himself, he's kind of shifting the criticism onto Mrs. Morris. So it's Mrs. Morris who's apparently a homophobe, not Tony.
So that's the facts. They can make all the claims that they wish. They're under the control and the authority of the ruler of the world. And that is so evident. Things have changed so dramatically in just the past few years. Some of the things happening globally, they would not have happened 10, 15 years ago. But here before our eyes, the very thing that Jehovah foretold through the scriptures, we're in the middle of it, right in the middle of it. So we're feeling what it's like to have lived in Sodom and Gomorrah.
Again, we have this idea of things have never been worse. You know, woe on anyone who isn't a Jehovah's Witness. You know, you're all doomed. The world has never been as bad as it is now. And he uses this strange reasoning where he says that some of the things that are happening now would never have happened 10 or 15 years ago. Well, that doesn't mean that the end's coming. I mean, he doesn't give any examples, so I don't know what he's alluding to. Let's say he's alluding to what ISIS is getting up to at the moment, you know, beheading journalists and aid workers on camera. That wasn't happening 10 or 15 years ago. But that doesn't mean it wasn't happening further on in the past. You know, you had guillotines in France in the 17th century. You had the Spanish Inquisition. You had people being tortured and mutilated for religious reasons. That's happening now under the banner of a different religion. So I don't know what claim he was making or what specifically he was referring to when he made that remark, but all you have, as you had on the Friday talk, was this fear-mongering and trying to instill in people this dread and this, you know, deep fear of what's happening in the world, when in actual fact, if Tony was actually forced to confront the issue, I'm sure he would much prefer to be living now than at any point in mankind's history. Things are better now than they ever have been.
Now, this talk will help us to go even closer to what Jehovah was wanting for us. And as I prepared this, I have to share this with, it's very humbling to understand what we're after here, because it's one thing to do the right thing, and you could do that as a baptized witness, doing the right thing, but the question is it with the mental disposition of the Christ? Now that puts it in a whole different realm. See, just doing it because, well, this is what I'm supposed to do. No, what Jehovah's looking for in us, and it's very humbling, not humiliating, but humbling, with the disposition of the Christ, oh boy, we have a long way to go.
This, I remember, was an intrinsic part of being a Jehovah's Witness, as the whole Jehovah's Witness experience was this idea that no matter how hard you work, no matter how good a person you try to be, it isn't ever going to be enough. And I think that was embodied in what we've just heard from Tony. He basically, well, he doesn't basically say, he does say, it's not enough just to do the right thing. You've got to do it with the mental attitude of Jesus. And guess who's going to tell you how to do it with the mental attitude of Jesus? So, you know, human beings, we're not daft. We have an innate sense of morality. We have built into us the realization that doing good things to other people is in our own interests. It's in our own interests to help others. So we're built to do the right thing. We know basically, obviously sociopaths and psychopaths don't have that, and they do hideous things to other people. But most normal people know how to do the right thing, and part of the whole kind of cult mechanism is to say, well, it's not just enough to do the right thing. You may applaud yourself for doing the right thing, but actually more is required, and we're the ones who are going to tell you what extra things you need to do on top of doing the right thing. So, really interesting part of Tony's talk.
Now, he showed his devotion, and this was addressed yesterday in one of the symposiums, but we're going to repeat the point here, and you'll notice that this has been done in this program. Repetition's the mother of retention. So notice John chapter 2.
Repetition is the mother of retention. Again, we're getting a fascinating insight into how cults work. If something is nonsense, then you're not going to get people to remember it by saying it only once. If something is nonsense, then you're going to have to keep repeating it and repeating it and repeating it and repeating it. And only then will the mud stick. Only then will people remember what it is you're telling them to do.
And he said to those selling the doves, "Take these things away from here. Stop making the house of my Father a house of commerce." Of course, the impact on the disciples, they recalled that it is written, "The zeal for your house will consume me." So we have learned in the past the whips, that was not for the humans, it's for the animals. This was a controlled, righteous, devoted man with indignation. How dare you? This temple was precious to Jesus, dear to his heart, and you scoundrels are in here commercializing where we worship Jehovah God. And make no mistake, he had powerful expressions, imperatives, as we exclaim here and show the exclamation point. This was not, well, take these things away from here. This really bothers me. No, he's all man, a perfect man. You just stop this commerce.
I guess this part's interesting for two reasons. One, there's that really camp part at the end where I'm starting to kind of connect the dots with Tony's homophobic remarks about tight pants when I see the way he portrays Jesus, or the hypothetical camp Jesus. But no, moving on to more serious things, I found the most disturbing or the most interesting part of this part of the talk was him discussing the righteous indignation of Jesus coming into the temple and seeing the money changers and, mixing commerce with faith. And, you can't help but watch the recent Stephen Lett JW Broadcasting video and see an irony here, because, Watchtower is abandoning its old ways and going after money, really kind of using its influence to try and get money out of witnesses' pockets. It used to, as I said in the video rebuttal to that episode, it used to be that people like Charles Taze Russell would say, well, if you give us money, you give us money and we're going to use it for the organisation. We're not going to ask you for it. All of that's gone now. Watchtower is using JW Broadcasting and other avenues to prize money out of witnesses' pockets. And by doing that, I would suggest they are making Jehovah's House a house of commerce. Because after all, when they build these kingdom halls, which just so happen to look just like Blockbusters or a Burger King or a commercial unit that you could very easily sell on, when they make these properties, they profit from them once they're sold. When they build something with free volunteer labour, or when they purchase property and it later escalates in value, as happened with Brooklyn, all of the money goes back to Watchtower and its dedicated funds that were used to acquire that property. And as I said in my last video, it just feels as though Watchtower is property mad at the moment. Everything seems to be, oh well, Jehovah needs this building, Jehovah needs that building, and it doesn't quite square up with what Tony's saying here about commerce and Jesus dealing with the money changers.
Because you see in verse 3, he touched him. Now, it's true that you go through the Mosaic law and they had to call out, unclean, these lepers, those that were suffering from leprosy, and to touch him. Well, the Mosaic law, the Pharisees, as we discussed earlier in the program, would have been all upset, but it's deeper than that. When it comes to the compassion, Jesus wasn't just trying to put on something for those watching. It's illustrated. We had a doctor report what happened to him. He was a specialist in leprosy, and he was in India. So he didn't speak the language of the local people, trying to do what he could to help those suffering from leprosy, a similar kind that they had here in Bible times. So he has an interpreter. So he's trying to do his job as a doctor there, but he puts his hand on the shoulder as he's talking to the man with the leprosy. And all of a sudden, the man just started to weep profusely, sobbing. So the doctor, what did I say? Because he was just trying to explain through the interpreter about his condition, what would happen. And it was quite a gripping moment because this doctor was a compassionate man. And the interpreter said, no, you don't understand. And this just grips me. He said, no one has touched him in years. First human touch in many years. And then the doctor got it. So you see the compassion of Jesus. He could have healed him from afar. No leprosy. But he made it a point to touch him.
Wouldn't it be fantastic if Tony Morris and the other members of the governing body had the same compassion with regards to shunning as he's talking about here in this illustration about this doctor who touches this leprosy patient and the patient starts weeping because it's the first time he's been touched in years. Where is the compassion with the shunning policy? Because all we're talking about here, whether it's the man weeping because he's not been touched in years, or whether we're talking about someone who commits suicide because they cannot cope with life without contact with their witness family members, we're talking about the same human mechanisms. We're talking about the psychology of humans, the fact that we're social creatures, we rely on social bonds, and when you sever those social ties without any good reason, it creates tremendous trauma in people. I might have already referred to Dr. Kip Williams. If you haven't watched his radio interview yet, please type into YouTube BBC Kip Williams ostracism and listen to that radio interview, because he talks about ostracism and how it works, how it's measurable. He's developed experiments to actually measure the anger that arises when people are suddenly cut off from interaction. He's developed a way of measuring it. This is very, very tangible human psychology and human hurt and pain that we're dealing with, and that's exactly what Tony Morris is talking about here when he refers to the leprosy patient. Why can't the governing body show compassion when it comes to shunning?
Another thing we would be devoted about is being resolute about not accepting employment that would prevent us from regular attendance at meetings or sharing in the ministry. It's not negotiable. We have to have our meetings. We have to share in the ministry. That's all. And we trust Jehovah to help us through it.
I think this came up in the last JW Broadcasting episode. It seems to be a recurring theme now where Watchtower are telling people with jobs, that these jobs are expendable if they conflict with the meeting and assembling convention dates and times that, you know, Watchtower give publishers. So again, very, very dangerous, corrosive and detrimental, particularly, you know, in the current world economic climate where, you know, jobs can come and go and aren't so easily to get once you've lost your job. I just think it's extremely ill-advised for the governing body to be ramming home this idea that if your job conflicts with a meeting or an assembly, you should give your job up. And I have actually known witnesses who have done that, and sure enough, they were out of work for a long, long time afterwards. And let's face it, Watchtower will not be picking up the tab.
You have your reasons. It's like we used to try to make sure when we're teaching our sons about the blood issue. Now, that was a lot hotter issue when they were growing up. It's improved because of the good work of hospital liaison committees and hospital information department, hospital information services. But boy, it was in a Catholic place like Rhode Island, very difficult. So they were taught it is not to be said, accepting blood is against my religion. No. This is with your power of reason. Where's the thinking there? Is that what your child would say? Is that what you would say? No, you have power of reason. This is because my God says don't eat blood. I worship him. You have that conviction. But they don't have it if they can't explain it to a reasonable degree. Just something to think about.
Two things here. Obviously, Tony brings up the blood issue, which, you know, is killing Jehovah's Witnesses. I wish we had figures on what the death toll is for the number of witnesses that have been killed since 1945 when the blood teaching came through. But, you know, Tony Morris brings it up here and he says, oh, it was a hotter issue when my kids were young, and it isn't now because of the excellent work of the Hospital Liaison Committee. So apparently, I don't know what constitutes a hot issue and why the blood issue is no longer a hot issue, and precisely what it is that the hospital liaison committees have done. Let's face it, all the hospital liaison committees do is go into hospitals and bully witnesses who are on their deathbeds into dying if needs be through refusing blood. How that's ethical, I wish someone could explain that to me. But no, I'm sorry to break the news to you, Tony, it's still a hot issue, and Jehovah's Witnesses are dying, you know, as we speak. Well, not necessarily as we speak, but there have been very recent cases where Jehovah's Witnesses have died. I think the latest case was a mother who left behind, I think, 9 children. She'd been advised on her 8th pregnancy that she was high risk, and she was disfellowshipped on her after accepting blood for her 8th pregnancy. And then when her 9th pregnancy came along and she needed blood, she refused it and ended up dying. And in the last few moments before she died, I write about this article on JW Survey. No, I didn't write about it, sorry. James Strait wrote about it. But just before she died, she recanted and said, oh no, I would like blood, but by then it was too late, and she left behind 9 children. So 9 children will grow up without a mother, thanks to Tony Morris and his chums insisting that certain medical treatments are against God's commandments. So I would consider that it is still a hot issue. Thank you very much, Tony. And any perceived improvement that you've noticed in this area, I don't know whether that's what you're referring to, but if you're referring to, you know, people being saved despite refusing blood, no, that's not the Hospital Liaison Committee, that's medical technology and doctors and hospitals bending over backwards to find whatever way they can to keep witnesses alive even though they're refusing blood. Nothing to do with the excellent work of Watchtower. The other thing I found very interesting about this clip was, again, we have this very condescending attitude. We've seen it already in these talks, and we see it regularly cropping up where Tony kind of sneers at his audience and says, you think Jehovah doesn't think this, and you think Jehovah doesn't notice that, and very condescending spirit. And that is in a way replicated here when he talks about how he raised his sons to refuse blood in a certain way. So in other words, it's not enough to say, blood transfusions are against my religion. No, that wording is wrong. That wording is wrong. You have to say that it's against what Jehovah wants, or something like, which is essentially the same thing. And how pedantic, how condescending and patronizing, and insisting that he has the correct wording and everyone else doesn't. Where is this written, Tony? In what Watchtower article is it written that unless we word things in that exact way, unless Jehovah's Witnesses, when they're refusing medical treatment, word things in precisely the correct way, they're upsetting Jehovah?
We've reviewed just 3 of many facets of Christ's mental disposition. His devotion, his conviction, his compassion, so much more could be said. But frankly, the best way to learn about Jesus' marvelous qualities is to study his life and ministry. Now, to help you to do that, we're happy to announce the release of a new book entitled Jesus, the Way, the Truth, the Life.
I don't actually have a hard copy for my collection yet. I understand a copy of this new Jesus book is going to be sent to me at some point, so thank you in advance to whoever sends me that book. But I have actually looked at the PDF version on jw.org, and yes, it's basically just a revamped, reworked Greatest Man book, and it even pretty much uses all of the old illustrations. As he says, they've added 1 or 2 new illustrations, but for the most part it's exactly the same illustrations from the old Greatest Man book. The only reason they've had to redo it is because of, as you heard there, changes in doctrinal understanding, in other words, new light. And if that doesn't explain how ludicrous new light is, I don't know what does. You have a situation where the Bible should never have to be revised, or books that are based purely on the Bible should never have to be revised. They should stand the test of time. Watchtower publications do not stand the test of time. They're like food. They have a best before date. And you get to a few years later and suddenly you have to completely revise the book because you've changed so many teachings since it was first produced that you need a new one. And in the case of the Greatest Man book, well, you have all sorts of things like the generation teaching, which is not specifically described in the old Greatest Man book, but it is strongly alluded to. And things like the faithful and discreet slave teaching from 2012, that will have had to have been updated. And it would all be unnecessary if the material in Watchtower publications was purely scriptural. In other words, if the only thing the Watchtower publications were talking about was the Bible, they would never need to release books year after year after year after year, because once you release one book, hey, it's about the Bible, what needs to be changed? But because they have to change, because they change their teachings on an almost yearly basis, you get to this ridiculous stage where it becomes like a factory production line, and they have to produce a new book every year, to the point where, as you can see, you have hundreds of books spanning many decades, all saying more or less the same thing, with just slight things readjusted to conform to new light. So now we're on to Tony's final talk on the Sunday afternoon of the convention.
And Saturday we were thrilled to watch 3 new become Jehovah's friend, and to help our young ones to imitate Jehovah's generosity, develop deeper appreciation, and imitate Jesus' truthfulness. So one little girl recently before the convention asked me, now, when are we going to get some more become Jehovah's friend? I said, stay tuned. See? So They got 3 at this convention, so let them enjoy that when they get to their convention, because as the brothers are recognizing, there's lessons there for the parent or parents as well, not just the children. So Jehovah's blessed you because he loves you and he loves your children.
I found that part quite intimidating. Jehovah loves you and he loves your children. We realise, we get it, governing body. We get it, Tony Morris. You want our kids. You want to indoctrinate the next generation of young minds to follow your every word, because let's face it, you can't convince adults, can you? No matter how many literature carts you put out on the sidewalks, you know, no matter how many doors you knock on, you cannot convince, you know, the majority of adults to follow your crazy teachings. But kids are an entirely different proposition altogether. If you lie to them from a young enough age, you can get them to believe pretty much anything, and that's precisely what the Become Jehovah's Friend videos are all about. And I found it interesting that he specifically mentioned in this clip that they're also for the parents. I think that was clear, that was obvious right from the beginning. It wasn't just about indoctrinating kids, it was about teaching parents to be extremely judgmental and harsh in their discipline, and joining in the governing body in scaremongering and making their kids believe that they're going to become old and shriveled like Adam and Eve if they don't do exactly what the governing body tells them to do. Even that recent video where Noah and his family were shown drowning, and that was supposed to be the outcome if Caleb and Sophia didn't listen at meetings. Yes, that's the kind of attitude that Tony Morris and the rest of the governing body want parents to have, because after all, if parents are going to be so grossly inappropriate in raising their children, then the governing body doesn't have to do anything, do they? They can they can delegate all of their responsibilities onto the parents.
Be happy to receive the book, Jesus, the Way, the Truth, the Life. You're all enjoying that. It's a beautiful piece of work that will benefit our families and us as individuals as we try to follow the footsteps of Jesus. Well, you think that's enough releases? Never is enough.
This was an intriguing clip where, you know, Tony's chuckling to himself, oh, it never is enough, there's never enough releases. And yeah, as I've already said, it's like a production line, isn't it? Every year there has to be new releases, not just one release, but several. Because for no other reason than because that's the benchmark that the organisation has set itself in the past. Witnesses don't need this much material, but because Watchtower's got into the groove of giving a book, maybe a brochure, maybe a DVD at every convention, well, that's what they have to do. And as soon as you slip into that mode of doing things, it becomes all about quantity rather than quality. And so, you know, witnesses just expect more of this stuff to be thrown at them, never mind whether it makes sense, never mind whether it's factual, never mind whether it's logical. So long as you're giving us nice, brightly coloured things, we're going to be happy.
And your young ones, we've been entreating you, you've got to get that clear. Especially as you get older, the only way you're getting through this storm, the great one, is your relationship with God. Your personal relationship, just like everybody else. Unless you're a toddler, we know how Jehovah will sanctify them. But as you get older, you are responsible. Remember the nice demo? We've mentioned that before. Well, I'm not ready to get baptized. Okay, let's hold off on your driver's license. What? I'm 16. What are you talking about? I'm ready. I know I'm ready. Yeah, you're ready for a driver's license, but you're not ready to dedicate your life. Explain that one to heaven. That's why we repeated it on the program.
I actually regret not watching the demonstration that Tony's referring to. I'm sorry, I just do not have time to watch an entire 3-day convention anymore. I just had to zoom in on Tony Morris's talks. But he alludes to this item, this demonstration on the program, which is a dramatization of this crazy piece of advice that he has already given in previous talks about driving licenses, where he basically tells parents to blackmail their children into getting baptized by refusing to let them get driving licenses when they turn 16 if they're not baptized by the age of 16. How this can possibly be perceived as appropriate behaviour by parents is beyond me. But this apparently is what Tony Morris wants people to do, and just to prove it, I'm going to show you where he's already said this in previous talks.
When they're old enough to reason, they cannot get through on your coattail. We've never said that. If they're old enough to understand the need for dedication and baptism, and like some used to say, well, I don't think I'm old enough, and I tell parents, because we raise sons, we know how it works. I said, okay. And one just got a little upset, and I used it several times. I'll tell you what, you tell them, okay, when you turn 16, I don't know about your state, but no driver's license. Oh, no, I'm ready. I am ready. I know I can handle a car when I'm 16. But you can't dedicate your life to get baptized, huh? Now, we never force it, but don't swallow that business.
So there's really nothing new about this. The governing body are very, very serious. They want kids to be baptized as early as possible. Mark Sanderson gave a talk as well recently where he said that all of the governing body were in agreement that baptism was the thing to do for any children between, I think, the ages of 9 and 11. So as young as 9, the governing body now expects parents to get their kids baptized. And of course, once they're baptized, show's over. You're locked into the organization for life. So very, very sickening. I can't talk about it too much without getting upset, because obviously I was baptized at the age of 11, and I don't need to remind you what happened. But very, very sinister and overt the way Tony Morris is urging parents to blackmail their children.
Stop storing up for yourselves treasures on the earth where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal. So he's saying stop it. See? And those that have cultivated a love of money, they've stabbed themselves all over with many pains, including emotional pain. So Jesus' counsel is stop it. And he reaffirms it clearly in verse 24, same chapter. And he doesn't say most, he says no one. No one can slave for two masters, for either you will hate the one and love the other, or he will stick to the one and despise the other. You can't do it. But those that store treasures in heaven, see, like all those that are traveling in here did all sorts of things to sacrifice. There's so many here from Warwick construction. See, you're tucking it away in the heavenly bank, sacrificing other things. Oh yeah, lots going into the heavenly bank. You're becoming millionaires, and you have peace of mind, joy, and refreshment. And imagine now people resurrected, and God willing, He'll keep that beautiful place for headquarters, and they come to visit, or resurrected ones, all that begins. What do you want to say? What were you doing before the Great Tribulation broke out? Well, I worked for IBM. I was a big executive. And they're resurrected and say, IB what? What is that? As opposed to sitting there and having a meal, what was it like to work there? Say, well, it's a personal choice, but Jesus is saying, stop it. Don't store it up. What good is it? Get the treasures in heaven.
Two things. First, you have the blatant coercion. Anything that you do in response to what we tell you to do, oh, you're sticking it away in the heavenly bank account. Any building work, especially building work, because we really need buildings. Jehovah absolutely needs buildings. So any building work, oh yeah, you're tucking it away in the bank account. Real kind of coercive terminology there. Oh, you're millionaires. No, they're not millionaires. They would be more millionaires if they had monopoly money. That's not even monopoly money you're giving them. It's completely imaginary money that you're giving them. for this, free cult labour. And there's also this strange fantasy which Tony alludes to, where he says, God willing, Jehovah will keep, once the entire earth has been has had the genocide of billions of people who don't want to observe him and his friends as the governing body, once all of those billions of people have been slaughtered and their remains, buried, God willing, God willing, the Warwick headquarters will be the capital of God's new earthly organisation. Absolutely crazy stuff. And, granted, he doesn't, set it in stone and say that's what's going to happen, but there's definitely, a fantasy going on there. And you wonder, just how much that fantasy is factored into the thinking of not just Tony, but other governing body members.
Stop judging that you may not be judged. So he says stop it because he knew his listeners were doing it. And he's telling God's people here at all these conventions, stop it, because I know some of you are doing this. You've got to stop it. Harshly judging others, comments like, somebody will say something about, this brother or sister and say, well, he's got a long way to go. Like we all don't. If you compare yourself to Jesus. See, Jehovah and Jesus would rather we say, look how far he's come. That's the way to think. Stop that judging. And judges always feel like they're so intelligent. These critics the same way. I can find fault anywhere I look. I am so smart. Take me anywhere on the planet, I can find fault. Well, Jesus is saying, stop it. It's just harsh, it's wrong.
The amazing thing here is that Tony is telling Jehovah's Witnesses not to be judgmental. Or as he puts it, just stop it. He's telling Jehovah's Witnesses not to be judgmental when he was voted by Advocate magazine one of 2014's most right-wing conservatives against gay and lesbian people for his remarks on tight pants. He basically was fiercely judgmental of anybody who wore tight pants or yoga pants. And not just that, but he went into other areas as well. He said that if you're not a ministerial servant by the age of 23, then you're not marriage material. Why should a sister marry a Jehovah's Witness who isn't made a ministerial servant by the time they're 20? I think it was 23. How is this not judgmental, Tony? You're telling Jehovah's Witnesses to just stop it when it comes to being judgmental. I cannot think of a more judgmental Jehovah's Witness period than Tony Morris.
So he's talking to Thomas and he says, put your finger here and see my hands and take your hand and stick it into my side and stop doubting, but believe. He made no indication whatsoever other than to just stop doubting. He didn't say, it's okay if you're a little slow to doubt. No, stop it. So that's Jesus' counsel there. Stop doubting. We don't have a legitimate basis for doubt. Doubt has to be rid from our minds. Whatever it's about.
I just find the arrogance here astonishing. Tony is really saying to his audience, just stop doubting. I'm telling you, stop doubting. You have no legitimate reason to doubt. I don't care what your doubts are, they're not legitimate. None of your reasons are legitimate, even though I've not heard what those reasons are. And comparing this situation where Jesus makes Thomas feel his wounds to prove that it's him, well, Jesus was giving Thomas evidence. He wasn't just telling Thomas to stop being a pain in the arse. He was saying, you don't need to doubt anymore because here's the evidence. The governing body isn't saying that. Tony Morris isn't saying that. He's not saying whatever questions or issues or legitimate concerns you may have, I promise you we have answers if you'll come to us and explain and tell us what your issues are. No. He's just saying, I don't want to hear what your problems are. Don't want to hear what your concerns are. Don't want to hear what your doubts are, because you shouldn't have doubts. Stop having doubts. How Orwellian can you get? He's telling people how to think, and what not to think.
Convince yourself, go back over why you came in the truth, the unity we enjoy doctrinally. Look at what's going on in these other religions, my word. And the global preaching work, the efforts to reach them in public witness, it's everywhere. See, and thankfully now, because the news agencies, you don't see them hardly ever do a story about us, because guess who runs the media? This is no surprise. I did news service work at conventions in the early days when I was in the truth. Very rarely did we get any decent press. We don't care anymore. We'll make our own news. We'll put it on JW broadcast. And I'll tell you, we get a lot of people that are not witnesses. It's directed. The audience is Jehovah's people. But they're like, who are these people? See? Because Jehovah's going to reach out and let them know, here's where the truth is.
Again, this really arrogant attitude when it comes to, this time the media, we'll make our own news. We'll put our own news on JW Broadcasting. If the media isn't giving the message that we want them to give, then we'll give our own message on JW Broadcasting. Well, we knew that you were using JW Broadcasting as propaganda. You didn't need to tell us. It's no surprise that you're using it in that way. But again, this idea as well of the media being Satan's media, which he alludes to very clearly here. We know who the media is controlled by. Well, I've highlighted this point before, but it's worth repeating. Repetition. It's worth repeating. In this book, 2009, Bearing Thorough Witness about God's Kingdom, the whole irony of this claim that it's Satan's media is exposed when you look at page 110, where it gives a list of all of the different committees of the governing body. And when you look at the Coordinators Committee, it says the Coordinators Committee consists of the coordinators of each of the other committees and a secretary who is also a member of the governing body. It helps all the committees to operate smoothly and efficiently. This committee oversees legal matters and the use of the media when necessary to convey an accurate picture of our beliefs. So it says it black and white there, that the governing body have as the roles of one of its committees the use of the media to convey its message. How can you use the media if the media is controlled by Satan? You may as well throw your hands up and not have anything to do with the media. But instead, what you see when it comes, especially around convention time, every summer, what you see is small newspapers in convention locations almost always running these stories about, the Jehovah's Witnesses are having their convention. This brings all sorts of trade and commerce to the city. We're very lucky to have them. They're giving Bible talks and talks that promote the family, blah, blah, blah. You nearly always get one of these fluff pieces in the local rag whenever there's a convention in town. And that's because of Jehovah's Witnesses using the media. And for some reason the media fall for it every time. Which is very sad. But again, this whole paranoia about the media, I think Tony Morris knows full well that it doesn't work that way. It's very, very difficult to get the media interested in Jehovah's Witnesses because they're a crackpot cult. And I noticed he specifically doesn't mention some of the really damning documentaries that have come out in the news. I'm thinking specifically about PBS and some of the brilliant work that Trey Bundy's been doing recently on child abuse. None of that gets mentioned here. Tony Morris is completely blanking that out and just wants to give us this idea that Jehovah's Witnesses are under siege, which really comes out in his next comments.
So don't be bogged down with these apostates, and be careful on the internet. We were talking about that this weekend with friends. Oh, my word, how many times did I tell you, be careful? You know, going here, going there, they'll suck you in. See, with some of this stuff, it can seem so innocent. We're just warning you that all we can do is admonish. Stick with what we have authorized. You'll be safe. You want to go out there, it's at your spiritual risk.
So you have this remarkable, generic, be careful about apostates. It's quite remarkable, really. I mean, Tony must know how much material there is specifically about him online, but he's terrified, isn't he, of alluding to it. He's terrified. There's no way, for example, he'd refer to my videos, even if he's watched them. There's no way he would, refer to specific websites, because he knows the second he mentions a website by name, let's say JW Facts, if he says don't go on JW Facts in one of his talks, what's one of the first websites a good majority of the witnesses will look at when they get home? What's the fuss about? Why did he single out that website? But I think it's very clear from this clip that Tony and the rest of the governing body are terrified by the work that so-called apostates are doing. And all they can offer in retaliation is just this fear-mongering and scaremongering and, be careful, the boogeyman's going to get you. They'll suck you in. Suck you? What? Suck into what? What am I trying to suck people into? I'm not advocating a new cult, a new religion. I'm just telling people to base what they believe on facts. And unfortunately, when you hold up Jehovah's Witnesses and Watchtower for scrutiny, what you find is that it's all based on nothing. It's all based on thin air, on fiction.
He also said, "Go therefore and make disciples, teaching them." As we make disciples, it's so refreshing to study the Bible with someone. My wife and I really missed that. We've tried the early years on the governing body and the demands of travel and such. But whenever we can, we get on a Bible study. We miss it. We had the privilege to have a large number come in the truth. It's so refreshing. So you have the circumstances. Get out, be refreshed.
I found this quite an interesting admission from Tony, because he's just admitted in front of a convention audience that he no longer conducts Bible studies, which is quite remarkable, really, when you consider I don't know whether it's a completely different religion now or what, but when I was attending meetings as a fully believing witness, as recently as, let me think, in the UK I was attending meetings in 2009, and I can remember the service meeting items on the Thursday evening when we would go over the kingdom ministry. And the kingdom ministry, whenever it referred to the ministry, seemed to be suggesting, I don't know whether it's different now, seemed to suggest that the whole purpose of our ministry was to conduct Bible studies. That, making disciples of people was the reason why we do the ministry. It's not to give out literature, it's to conduct Bible studies and start Bible studies. That's the whole point of the ministry. So if Tony's admitting now that he is not doing Bible studies, then if he is going on the ministry, which I highly doubt, then what's the point of going on the ministry? If he absolutely refuses to make disciples, or if he's thrown in the towel when it comes to making disciples, what's the point of his ministry? And this is interesting because in a recent JW Broadcasting video, I think it was a segment that was promoting the international conventions, and for some reason it threw in, from left field, this footage of Tony and his wife on a doorstep preaching together.
It's so apparent Jehovah's behind this. The example set by the slave, it's so evident this should be done.
Clearly intended to send a message out that, the governing body members, they do preaching too, they go on the preaching work too. Well, why do they do the preaching work if it's not for Bible studies? If they hand it over to someone the minute interest starts to be shown, what exactly are they doing? Anyone could do that. So I just found that very, very interesting, because the last I heard, the last I checked, the whole point of the preaching work is to do Bible studies.
So despite knowing his Father favors only the humble and his apostles often lacked humility, Jesus didn't pull away from having confidence in them that they would succeed. Because the Jews had that issue, and I think, not to offend anybody that might be Jewish here, but there was an issue there with position. Other cultures have it too, and Jesus knew what humility meant to Jehovah. It was in the Psalms, not like this was some new teaching, but then to see them behave that way because of the influence of the culture, but it didn't change his confidence in them.
This is incredible. As though we haven't been treated to enough nonsense already, Tony throws in, free of charge, buy one get one free, a bit of anti-Semitism. What is a convention talk by a governing body member if it doesn't have a little bit of anti-Semitism? And here we learn that Jewish people, the Jewish culture, is obsessed with position. Other cultures have it too, but I'm going to single out the Jewish culture as having a problem in the area of wanting position. This is blatant anti-Semitism, and if you don't believe me, all you need to do is reconstruct the sentence so that the problem is not whether someone is Jewish or not, but whether they like position. And if that's the case, he doesn't need to mention Jews at all. All he needs to say is the Jewish followers had a problem with position, as lots of people in lots of different cultures do. That's all he needs to say, but he singles out the Jewish culture, which is exactly what Joseph Rutherford did in the Declaration of Facts. And I mentioned in a recent video, I'm reading this book at the moment, which I can thoroughly recommend. If you're like me and you're really fascinated with the history of Watchtower, this is Jehovah's Witnesses and the Third Reich by Jim Penton, where he absolutely and utterly dissects the whole legend of Jehovah's Witnesses during the Second World War. And he talks about the Declaration of Facts, which I've actually read on one of my previous videos, where Joseph Rutherford talks about commercial Jews and how terrible commercial Jews are. And people have actually tried to defend this by saying, oh well, Rutherford wasn't talking about all Jews, he was just talking about commercial Jews, so therefore it was not anti-Semitic. No, it is anti-Semitic, because either Rutherford's problem is Jews or people who are commercial. If all he was complaining to Hitler about were people who are commercial, then why did he even need to mention Jews? He singled out Jews. That's precisely what Tony Morris did here, and I find it fascinating. It would actually make, if this book is ever updated, because it discusses how there's always been just a very slight thread of anti-Semitism in Watchtower literature going back. And he even quotes, I was reading last night about an account of Nathan Knorr remonstrating with the Bethelites who happened to be Jewish, and basically using the fact that he was a Jew against him in his criticism. Very, very scathing discipline for this Bethelite, and that was Nathan Knorr after Rutherford. So it's just interesting to see Tony continuing this legacy of a slight anti-Semitism within the organisation.
But the big complete conquest is at Armageddon. And now it's so nice and clear, and the brothers did well on the Watchtower summary, but turn to Revelation 17, and this is crystal clear, and like I've been telling different ones, it reveals to me, as Jehovah makes it clear and clear what's going to happen during the Great Tribulation regarding the anointed as well, it appears to me he must be getting ready to bring it down. The cry of peace and security, as I mentioned on Friday, that Brother Loesch considered at a morning worship that's on the broadcast, it's all coming clear. And that's what Jehovah always does. He lets everybody know, here's what's going to happen. So he's influencing the faithful slave to get his people ready, and in this talk too, trying to get them ready for the big storm.
Jehovah's getting ready to bring it down, because there's a big storm coming. I talked about this at the beginning of the video, near the beginning of the video, so I don't want to repeat myself, but there's a real cry wolf element here of every convention, every year, every watchtower. It's imminent, it's just around the corner. I love that cartoon. There's a cartoon somewhere of of a car going round on a circular road, and there's a sign that says Armageddon just around the corner, and of course the car is just perpetually going around the corner. But yeah, that is what it's like when you're a witness. You're on this hamster wheel of the end is any time soon, the end is any time soon, the end is any time soon. And the fact that they were saying this in Russell's time, the fact that they were saying the end was going to come in 1914, the fact that they were saying the end was going to come in 1925, the fact that they said the end was going to come in 1975, the fact that they said that the end was going to come before the last person who saw the events of 1914 died away. None of these things apparently matter, and witnesses are quick to forget all of the failed predictions and buy into this kind of fear-mongering.
During the Great Tribulation, any that are of the remnant are still on earth. They're already sealed. You saw that in the Watchtower today, and we've said that in the past. Been sealed, guaranteed life in heaven. So when the nations, God comes after, this coalition of nations, those anointed that are still on earth, boom. So during that time, they're in heaven. It's not time to meet former friends and chat, because they're in the middle of this great storm, because all those called, all the anointed are going to be there, the 144,000. And that's who Christ Jesus is going to use to conquer. Because 144,000, now the angels would be enough. One angel is powerful enough, but to have 144,000 that Jehovah has given immortality to, oh. So the demons got tens of thousands, no doubt about it, a substantial number. But we're talking about myriads and myriads of faithful angels. Jesus and the 144,000. You'd think they'd say, we give up now. But they're spiritually insane. They don't have a chance. That's why they're enraged. That's why they're after the remnant while they have opportunity. Anybody associating with the remnant, this is war. He hates them because he knows what's coming. See? So do his demon brothers.
This is absolutely astonishing rhetoric. Demon brothers, this is war. And I just find it fascinating how Tony... the way Tony's mind works fascinates me. I would love to, I know I've spoken to him on the phone very briefly, but I'd really like to, just from a purely sociological and psychological point of view, just to kind of sit down with him and have a conversation to find out a little bit more about how his mind works, because it's quite interesting when you listen to him just now. He thinks in very literal ways. So he explained there that according to him, according to Watchtower, when Armageddon comes, just before Armageddon comes, the anointed are going to go whoosh. They're going to be raptured to heaven. And the way it's fascinating, he says, we're not going to have any time to chat, you know. So Tony's clearly thought about this in quite some detail, you know. He's not going to be able to sit down with Joseph Rutherford and Guy Pearce and Fred Franz and all of these, you know, mates of his that he probably would like to meet, or, you know, heroes from his past. No, he's not going to have time to chat. He's going to have to get straight to work in heaven. And you're thinking, but Tony, this is... How can you possibly try to imagine what's going to happen in heaven when you're a spirit being? Aren't you being a little bit too literal? And then he talks about how the anointed are going to be the ones used to bring judgment, which again has interesting psychological connotations, because Tony, like Gerrit Loesch, we've learned from previous talks, has thought an awful lot about the carnage that's going to happen at Armageddon, which implies that he's actually looking forward to killing billions of people as one of these spirit creatures who's gone up to heaven shortly before Armageddon. He's relishing the thought of this genocide, of this carnage. Very, very interesting psychological issues once you start exploring, the way he phrases things. And I'd love to sit him down and try and get into his mind a bit more.
Jesus performed many miracles while on earth. But are they simply a collection of stories from the past, or clues to something far grander? A glimpse into a wondrous future? A future where God will satisfy the desire of every living thing. The real life that God promises to each of his faithful servants.
We now have this really disturbing video, very deliberately designed to pull on the heartstrings and make people feel emotional towards this fictitious promise that's been made about the paradise. But I just think it's worth, noting about this video that there are only two parts of that short sequence that we've just seen that are unlikely to happen. One is where they open the shutters and there's a giraffe. That's, unless you live next to a zoo, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to do that, wherever you live. Usually giraffes and people live quite far apart. The second is the bit where there's like a meadow in what looks like, I don't know, Switzerland type Northern Europe, where there's an elephant wandering through the meadow. Again, not in its natural habitat, not a likely thing that you could expect to see. But apart from those two sequences, if you just edited those sequences out and just played that video, none of those things have to be a future paradise. All of those things are things that you can do now. And this is a point I try to make at the end of my book. Basically, I'm writing the end of my book while I still haven't finished the middle part. So I've kind of leapt forward and written the end part. And I talk in my book about paradise, and I allude to conversations, events that happened when my mum died, and a point I make about paradise, or try to make, is that everything that we look forward to when it comes to paradise and being in nature and interacting with loved ones in beautiful surroundings, those are all things that you can do now. You can do them now, but the only reason why lots of Jehovah's Witnesses aren't doing them, aren't travelling, aren't experiencing our planet the way they can possibly experience their planet if they tried, the reason they're not doing it now is because they're too busy serving a cult in the hopes that they can cash in their chips and have it all good in a future afterlife that's not going to come. I just think that's the sad part when you watch that sequence. Yes, it's all very beautiful. Those are all things that you can do now, and the most sickening part of this sequence is still ahead. So again, highly emotional music, really pulling on the heartstrings, and we have a child in a wheelchair, and the idea is given that the child's got up from the wheelchair and is running along the beach with her friends, she's been miraculously healed from this debilitating problem that she's had, so that she can now run along the beach. And this is another false promise, but I think in some ways it's more sinister and more evil than the simple promise of living in an idyllic environment, because I just think the false promise and the false hope that is given these ones, I mentioned it in a recent video, a recent JW broadcasting video, where they were they were talking about blindness. You know, it's one thing for people to have to cope with these issues and with these conditions, but I think when you come along and you say, you know, do what I tell you to do and I can make that better, there's something really morally and ethically wrong about doing that. It's a false promise. You're exploiting someone's pain and someone's anguish for your own ends, and that's why this part of the video really troubles me, but there's another part coming just now which troubles me even more. So strongly implied here is this idea of dead people rising from their graves, emerging from thin air, and, you know, being embraced by their loved ones. And I don't know how much I've said about on previous videos about, you know, my own loss, losing my mother, but I find the way that the grieving process is very cynically hijacked, and, you know, grieving people are told, well, don't worry, your dead loved one isn't quite dead. He or she is still alive in Jehovah's memory, and the way for you to see them again is by doing precisely what we tell you to do. Something extremely wrong and extremely cynical about that when you really think about it. I mean, don't get me wrong, I still believe very strongly that the governing body and the people who come up with this atrocious material are suffering from delusion more than anything, but all things considered, it's still evil, it's still morally reprehensible. And one of the things that I'm most bitter about when I think about Watchtower is the fact that something like the grieving process is hijacked and put on hold and exploited for Watchtower's aims.
But how can this beautiful future be possible? Because of what Jesus did for us. He came to earth for a purpose. He gave his life for those he loved. The curse of inherited sin and death could now be lifted from each one of us.
So now it's all about Jesus, and you can see why they've included this segment in the dramatization, in the propaganda movie that they've done, whatever you want to call it, because it's called the Imitate Jesus Convention, and it brings things nicely, it uses the theme of the convention effectively. But I don't need to tell you that there are lots of people who believe in Jesus and try to follow Christianity as closely as possible according to the Bible, who just so happen to not believe that they need to orient their lives around the whims of a group of men in New York.
If we look intently to Jesus, we will no longer be lost. He will show us the way to the Father.
If we look intently to Jesus, we will no longer be lost. Now, this is interesting because all cults depend on you being lost. They need you to be emotionally vulnerable, in a state of panic, in a state of turmoil, going through some kind of ordeal, the loss of someone, feelings of uncertainty, all of which anyone can have, regardless of how right or wrong their beliefs are. But cults like Jehovah's Witnesses absolutely need you to be lost in order for their promises to have some kind of traction. So that's why you have this segment at the end of the video with the man with the bananas going, "Oh, come." They need you to be in an absolute state of confusion and panic and turmoil and not knowing where to turn. That's how cults work. That's how they entice people. You know, if you're happy with your life, and if, you know, nobody's life is perfect, but, you know, let's suppose that, you know, things are going well for you, you're successful, your family's prosperous, you're in a loving environment, those who you love are around you. Yes, you might have lost people through death, but, you know, you've grieved their loss, and, you know, it's not inhibiting you. You're emotionally healthy, you're, you know, mentally, everything's where it should be. I'm sorry, but no matter what Jehovah's Witnesses say when they come calling on you, it's not going to make any difference. You know, you're going to reject what they say as nonsense, or at least you're going to do that as soon as you jump on Google after they've gone. Witnesses absolutely need people they call on to be lost, to be in a state of torment. That's how cults operate, and that's perfectly highlighted in this video.
In the very near future, Jehovah God is going to have Christ Jesus reign in righteousness. After Armageddon, righteousness will be ruling forever. No more unrighteousness, all to Jehovah's honor, glory, and praise.
So there we have it, the conclusion to Tony's last talk on the Sunday afternoon, and, you know, again, a perfect example of how cults like Watchtower, doomsday cults operate. The end is coming very, very soon, and once the end comes, everything's going to magically correct itself, and, you know, righteousness will reign forever. It's all going to be okay, but you need to do what we tell you to do. And I think that these clips that I've shown you are an excellent study in microcosm of how all cults work. They prey on people who are emotionally vulnerable. They scare people into believing that unless they huddle as close as possible to the center of their organization, that they're doomed, that they're in a state of turmoil. If they're inactive, they must be groveling at home in tears on the sofa. They're pitiable. You know, how dare they not go to meetings? They're sinning. They're guilty for not sticking as close to the organization as possible. And whatever you do, don't look at material from outside the organization. You know, be as terrified as we are at the prospect of having what we're teaching proved to be false. These are all elements that were expressed in Tony Morris's talk, so that's why I thought it was important to, you know, offer my opinions and my rebuttals to what Tony says. Yes, partly it's because I'm fascinated by him. I think he's a very interesting specimen, and you know, I'm sure this isn't the last video that I'm going to do about Tony, but yeah, I just thought it was interesting to examine what he was saying as, you know, a representative of the governing body, which is what he was on this occasion. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it interesting. I'm going to be making another video shortly to deal with the July JW Broadcasting episode, and thank you for watching.